So I chose to introduce you to Freud's new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, which he gave University of Vienna to a large audience of mixed professionals and lay intellectuals and people in the public. And it, I feel, is one of his most accessible works. That his style is such that it's quite graspable in terms of its structure and even the translation. Many people, when they read the lectures, they think that that Freud is just spontaneously speaking, but that's not actually the case. You know, in German academia, many professors, most in those days, going back in the history of teaching, is that people prepare a lecture, and so it's a prepared presentation that appears that he's speaking spontaneously to the audience, and so it shows a style of being able to present his ideas in ways that are personal and personable, and yet quite cutting in terms of their and penetrating in terms of their intellectual savvy. So the lecture on the dissection of the psychical personality and the lecture on anxiety, I feel, are the two most important pieces that would apply. And it introduces you to a way of thinking about the mind in novel ways that often isn't even being discussed today. If you were just to watch The National, when they have people come on, professionals, doctors coming on, talking about mental illness, the way it's presented, it's such a simplistic way of thinking that, again, it's brain science. It's something all about symptoms. You don't hear anything about well, what would be fueling those symptoms? What would be causing them? And when it does get around to that, we have this extremely reductive argument. It goes down to the brain. And so what you do is you give a pill and it changes the brain. And it's rather nauseating as a professional to see this over and over again. Like, why don't we have a psychoanalyst on the panel speaking? Such as, why do you think somebody would be depressed? Maybe they had a great deal of trauma in their life. Maybe they have internalized a dead mother, and that they are structurally dead inside. Maybe they have had no healthy attachment figures in their life, where they don't feel a sense of emotional connection to other people. That they question their very capacity for their own self-worth and love. That there's some sense of an internal persecutory superego that feels a need to punish themselves or to feel like they don't deserve to be happy. And these are things that are unconsciously informed. And we need to understand what unique configurations within this person's psyche is creating the conditions for which someone would then have a clinical condition that we would call depression, what Freud would have referred to as melancholia. That's when we say, the psyche is a little bit more complicated than just what neuroscience is telling us. And we have to ask ourselves, what's more useful? Do we truly want to understand the inner experience of another? And if we do, wouldn't we have more accessibility for understanding that by trying to encourage them to talk about their inner experience? And that's what our field has to offer. Articulating one's inner experience is part of the therapeutic process. Getting a person to do so is not always an easy task. As Freud tells us, when he talks about the notion of internal resistances and defenses to wanting to know. In fact, it's Lacan that says that our knowledge, first and foremost, is a paranoid one, meaning that we don't really want to know. We're terrified of the truth. The desire not to know what really we are experiencing, thinking deep down inside, is so frightening to people because they have to face the truth. So what we do is we employ a variety of sophisticated defenses where we have either wiped that out, not acknowledging it, disavowing that it even exists, to dissociating them, to you're building very sophisticated structural defenses to keep them at bay so we can function. And that really is not just a statement about psychopathology. It's a statement about the human psyche. It's a statement about all people, not just gender specific, not just based upon age, not based upon race or ethnicity or region or time. We're talking about universals that apply to all people, and one could challenge that. But before you do, let's hear the arguments. So, in Freud's view, he wants to put forth a universal theory of mind, but it also speaks to a broader notion of human nature. And so when we ask things such as what constitutes the psyche or the personality in today's language, Freud believes that there are many elements that are important for us to take a look at because they are constantly interplaying in how we think, function, act, perceive, and experience the world. Experiencing ourselves, others within the world. And so on one level, this is a normative theory of mind, meaning that it applies to everybody, and in and of itself it's not necessarily pathological. On the other hand, it highlights reasons why people would develop pathological, for lack of a better term, symptomatology. If we look at the structure of the particular essay, it's a rather interesting way of presenting the material because he doesn't start with the unconscious, so to speak. He starts with the ego. And what is the ego? See, Freud never used the word ego and id and superego. These were English translations into Latin. The word ego is in German ich or I, the I. Das ist is the it. So the translation should really be the I and the it, not the ego and the id. However, what do we? Yes, Latin. It's an English translation into Latin. So id is it. Yeah, the it. Yeah, sure. So why did he choose these words? Well, he's using the personal pronoun I. So when you think about yourself, you think I, or you think, this is me. And usually, that's a conscious construct. When you're having a thought to yourself, dialogue with yourself, you're usually relating to an image of your own identity as a personal one. Whereas the id, is really this unconscious, alien thing that seems like a separate entity. It's like, have you ever had things happen and you just don't understand why you did that? Have you ever had thoughts pop into your mind or feeling a wave of anxiety come over you and you have no idea where this came from? Well, often our unconscious is speaking to us here. It does seem foreign. It does seem alien. It does seem like an impersonal thing, like an it, that this it has happened. The term he reappropriated from Nietzsche at the suggestion of one of his disciples, so to speak, Grotic, but it stuck. Today we often refer to an unconscious realm or spacing that's operative and that we're not always aware of. And it's important because the assumption is that you are never transparent to yourself or to others. There's always something beyond that mask. If we want to use depth metaphors, when Freud talks about the unconscious as more of a topography, where you have a series of gradations of consciousness from what we know, perceive, feel, think in the present to something's just outside of our realm of consciousness, such as the preconscious realm. We're not really aware of it until our attention's drawn to it. Like you're probably not thinking of your sitting in your chair and and the discomfort you might have in your back until your attention's drawn to it. To then a realm that really isn't at all accessible to our immediate consciousness, but it makes itself known. And it makes itself known in all kinds of ways. If you're honest with yourself, if you start to develop a certain perceptibility or self-reflective awareness of your inner thoughts and actions, you'll see it every day. So for instance, Freud talked about the psychopathology of everyday life. He talks about it in the terms of faulty achievements, the parapraxes. You know them as the Freudian slip, the slip of the tongue, the slip of the pen, bungled actions, forgetfulness. So for instance, is it a coincidence that you locked your keys in your car of the morning that you had to be at a very important meeting and you couldn't be late, but you locked your keys in your car? How could that be? Doesn't this communicate some sense of ambivalence, that you don't really want to be there, that you're perhaps anxious about the whole thing? Do you ever have this thought blocking where, who is that person? I can't remember their name. And then you say, oh, you mean that's the person who humiliated you publicly when you were a child? Oh, it happens to be your 6th grade school teacher. What's her name? So there's things that are happening in our psyche that are, showing how there's certain resistances, yet they clearly communicate some kind of message. People who are, you're mindful of these slips all the time once you become more aware of it. You're writing something on your computer, you're sending off an email to somebody, and you intend to say one thing, but something else comes out. And then it's either you caught it in a proofread or you sent it off. And so, a friend of mine recently is coming to visit me, and sends something off, and it was because he didn't check, had entirely different meaning than what he wanted to convey. And so, of course, in today's world, we're communicating this way. You don't know what the affect is, or the tone, or the context of an email. So it's easy to misinterpret what was said. However, we then project our own meaning into things all the time. It's like, look at this email. Look at it. The person's enraged. They're out of control. Of this emotionality. And I'm just reading it. It just seems like they're communicating a message. So there are many different ways that the unconscious can communicate. Of course, in our dreams. Our dreams are a gateway, the royal road, as he put it, to the unconscious. But so are symptoms. Our symptoms, as Freud put in his first introductory lectures, 1916, 1917, he talks about the sense of a symptom. That a symptom has a certain sense or purpose. It communicates something. Hence, we just had a patient who was in an automobile accident, and she developed a sense of muteness. She can barely speak, and it's just a whisper. And it's not a selective mutism. It's not like I'm deliberately not going to speak. It is, I'd like to speak, but I can't. And so what we have is a conversion phenomenon. What Freud, what we used to call hysteria, that there was a certain compromise formation in the psyche that is mutating a certain conflict, channeling it into a symbolic form that we now see as the manifestation of a symptom. There's nothing wrong with this woman. She had brain scans. They've checked organically. They say everything's functional. Nothing's wrong with her vocal cords. Why is it that she would like to speak but can't? Well, in the course of the interview, why would a little, fender bender that would result in some kind of minor whiplash, not even, you don't even go to the hospital for, why would this create this kind of symptomatology? Well, in the course of the interview, it finds out, and believe me, it was not an easy interview, because she's just whispering and barely able to really talk. It's more or less having to fill out testing and things like this to communicate. Finds out that she was raped when she was a teenager, and she's never spoken about it. So, what I anticipate will happen here is that these very painful dissociated types of affect states, associated this trauma that wasn't really worked through, is now having to confront itself. It's confronting itself in the symptomatology. So it's not going to be about recovering from the automobile accident. It's the automobile accident was a trigger for the earlier kinds of traumatic experiences that she couldn't talk about, but now has to confront. So this is very, very interesting that these kinds of conversion experiences still occur, because we don't often see them as much in today's culture. And one reason for that is that most people are quite open about knowledge, about various types of social phenomena, that there aren't certain restrictions that used to be placed upon, you can't talk about that, you can't think this. Well, we think it all the time. So if you look at, just look at our media, everything is transparent, so to speak. There aren't so many taboos that there used to be at the turn of the century, dealing with Victorian sensibilities that Freud was writing about during his time. This gets to another element. He opens his essay up by talking about the I, the ego, but very quickly shifts into what is a modification of the ego, or a split-off agency, what we'll translate as the superego, or the Über-Ich, the above I, the I that's over the I. And Freud very much wants us to appreciate how a superego functions. So, for instance, in some of his essays, early essays, referring to the superego, which applies the strictest moral standard to the helpless ego, which is at its mercy. All at once, that our moral sense of guilt is the expression of the tension between the ego and the superego. So, the superego is the seat of moral judgment. It is also a critical faculty, meaning that it judges harshly. It has certain ideals and values that it rigidly applies. And it judges ourself. And it also judges others. So this element, of course, governs the notion of what's right and wrong, what are also our ideals, the things that we aspire toward, the things that we identify with, the things that we want to become, as well as a notion of perfection, of which we often try to strive toward, but inevitably always fail. We always fall short of. But yet we tend to apply in a very rigid way that you've got to be this, you've got to act this way. And think of how the superego functions in your life, let alone in people's lives who suffer. People who constantly are judging others, putting others down, devaluing, they are also doing this of themselves. That the depressive is the person who flagellates themselves, beats themselves up in a very masochistic way, in the sense that there's something about you needing to be punished, you need to suffer, that you are imperfect, that you are worthless, and these kinds of scripts are stemming from superego injunctions. And often, of course, the superego is the internalization of the other, and usually our parents. In fact, that's what developmentally seems to be certain. Because whoever dominates the scene early in life, whoever that is, mom, dad, surrogate mom, dad, surrogate attachment figure, whoever that might be, could be other siblings, other family members, could be the nanny. That figure or that set of figures is what we come to internalize. It becomes the basis of the structure of our own personalities. You only have to think about your own parents. Think about who they were growing up, how they affected you. It's amazing how over time, if you look for it, you'll say, I'm just amazed how much I've internalized my parents. It's like I'm just like my parents, or I'm just like my mother, or I'm just like my dad. Not totally, of course, but you do things, you act things out that are automatic, that are conditioned, and you say, geez, he did that to me too. So you can't escape it. Our parents are such dominant figures in our psyche. Even if you don't think about them, they are thinking in you. I have a patient who is afflicted by his upbringing. His father would always invalidate him. He, a Dutch Calvinist, moved to Canada, immigrated, started what? A nursery, and the son grows up in the same environment. And what he had internalized was nothing but criticism. So, is it a coincidence that the man suffers from a sense of inferiority and depression, where he's constantly questioning the validity of his ideas, his thoughts? At times he said, I'll be out in the field and I still hear him speaking. It's burned a hole on his consciousness. Yeah.
There are sometimes situations that when we realize we just see the human
by observing your own act, yeah. So hopefully you become the good mother.
A good mother.
Yeah. It's important because, of course, our parents are imperfect, and I think a mark of mental health is to be able to see your parents in a holistic way. Of course, when you're younger, you have certain idealized fantasies. My mom was best mom, my dad was the best dad. And then you kind of realize, well, yeah, until he used to lose his temper and hit us when we were bad. It's like, so maybe early in life, I was bad. I deserved to get spanked. Oh, did you? Well, I don't know. I never spanked my 3 daughters. Never, even though I was spanked, because I think I realized that was wrong. And then you kind of realize, well, maybe they're not so perfect. There's this good and bad, and we see them more as human beings now, not either idealized or vilified, but more holistically. The ability to integrate is a capacity for health. So, just like when you fall in love with someone, of course, The initial phase is complete idealization. You're in love, everything's great. And then the honeymoon starts to, fade away. And then we see our partner as good and bad. Take the good with the bad, and you blend them, and you hope that there's more good than bad. There's certain things that you're going to love, and there's certain things that you're going to hate. And that's important, because that's exactly what Freud is trying to, try to get people to see. That you can't have one without the other. That people have very intense internal emotional reactions. That often they are so powerful they wish to squelch or repress or deny because they are unacceptable. It's amazing how many people deny human or basic human, attributes. Like, oh, I don't hate anybody. What do you mean you don't hate anybody? What are you talking about? In fact, love needs to have its opposition in order to intensify the feeling. Now, when we say hate, these are different gradations of emotions. So, for instance, we are taught very early on in life, you don't hate. And if you do, you don't tell anybody about it. Just keep it to yourself. That's not socially appropriate. However, certain defenses will allow this to come out. Others, people clamp on things in order to function. So, of course, when you're in a position of being a student, one doesn't always say what one thinks, because there's the fear that the professor is going to evaluate you negatively. And there's a certain anxiety about doing well, proving oneself. And of course, this is a power differential. There's a certain inherent hegemony to that. But when one is not being evaluated, one tends to be a little bit more free with one's thoughts, especially with loved ones. But there we have to be very careful too, because we could offend the other very easily, such as when my wife and I get into screaming matches about some certain ideological differences. It could be anything from contemporary art, which I think is shit. She'll probably see this. So, the point is that this is the broad range of our emotional lives. So we only see people in a certain context. I'm seeing you in this context. If I got to know you privately, you'd be different than here. If I got to know you as a patient, you would be entirely different. Getting back to the notion of Freud's essay. So he starts out with the importance of the superego and how it plays out. And if you start looking for it, you'll see it in everywhere. People get passionate about their ideals to the degree that they're delusional, to the degree that we're going to kill somebody over it. Let's just conveniently pick ISIS for no reason, but I mean, like, that's the extreme form of fanatical crazy, that people are willing to kill others for the belief in an ideal, which they will take as a concrete ontological object, meaning God, that tells them that you must believe and you must submit. And if you don't, you need to be killed. And we can go out there and we can kill others who don't feel or believe the same way we do, or if they don't have the same values about, being able to subjugate women and children and enslave them in their own lands. So you could take any form of ideology. That just came to mind, given that what's happening in the world today. But it could be people are so passionate about their causes. These are all superego functions. Somebody who's willing to, die for the principles. Thinking of some other crazies, the people in Oregon, the militia movement. Are they still there? Are they still taking the compound? They're still there. Okay. When you get somebody like, I'm willing to die for my principles. He's got a shotgun there ready to go. He said, what for?
Forgot to bring food.
They forgot to bring some food there.
Yeah, they asked them to buy some. They planned to be there for months. They didn't bring them weekends.
Well, there you go. There's what we call there's a lack of observing ego. The observing ego is that capacity for self-reflection, the capacity to reflect on oneself and to think about what one will need past the weekend. Such as food. Yeah, that's important. We have plenty of ammunition. Well, as we are picking on various people randomly, which I like to do, in this context at least, that, this really comes out all the time. People are very bothered when their ideals, their values are being breached by others. They often conveniently can forgive themselves when they breach them themselves. It's very hard to live up to ideals. In fact, it's impossible. Because by the very nature, an ideal is something that's not real. It's not attainable. How can you be the surrogate or a symbolic Jesus? So how can what Jesus really personifies is the notion of of perfection, which of course we could never be, and of course the historical Jesus was far from that. But nevertheless, it serves a collective cultural function of the Savior, of the person that died for my sins. I mean, these are social, functional objects for people to feel good about themselves and to strive toward. When Freud further gets into the notion of how important that superego, that critical agency, but also the notion of ideality operates, is it's reflective in about everything we do. It's reflective in all our sophisticated defenses. Freud initially talks about identification. He says that identification is the assimilation of one ego to another ego, as a result of which the first ego behaves like the second in certain respects, imitates it, and in a sense takes it up into itself. Identification is a very important form of attachment to someone else. So this is Freud writing, speaking in 1932. He's talking about attachment.
Is it like social learning in a sense? Like how you observe people doing things and adapt to that, just like you probably perhaps.
Well, that's one interpretation, a behavioralist interpretation of learning theory. But Freud would say it's much more dynamic than that. So that there are certain elements that we're going to identify with the other person. We're going to not simply imitate, but we want to understand, why does that person identify with someone? What does that person mean? Or what does the function serve that person that you've identified with? That you would want to become like that person or be that person. And hence it has a very symbolic notion of what we are going to identify with, like, let's say, our parents. And we take in their values, even though we don't think about it like that. We might think about it as we just simply learned that. But no, not necessarily. Not just learning, but it's a selective learning. A selective, like, I value that to the degree that I'm going to make that my own ideal. And I'm going to then want to live up to that. Because certainly there's certain aspects of our parents that we may not like. We may disidentify with. We would say, I don't want to be like that. But other elements, maybe more of a holistic feeling, is that, yeah, you've taken in your parents.
Is this always finding like similarities between you and other people and kind of things that who you are? Or can it kind of arise out of other people challenging like your strong ideals, and you kind of gain insight that helps you kind of change your initial ideals to something more beneficial?
I think you've captured it well. I mean, it's not just an either or. That there are many elements here at play. So, of course, when we are challenged, well, most people just, like when you grow up, this is what my parents believe, this is what I believe. Until you get a little older and you start thinking about it. Then you say, well, what's the argument here? Or what's the reason for believing in this? And then you realize, well, that's not really how I don't think that holds water anymore. And it could be everything from religion to politics to you name it. You may have various views that you just wholeheartedly have adopted because you haven't really thought about them critically, to other things that you adopt because they feel right to you. So there's a certain moral sense that, again, a superego function, a moral sense that's part of your interior that you may not know all the intellectual arguments for, but it feels good. However, this is also the foundation of all of our emotional prejudices. That if something doesn't feel good to me, it's not good. But doesn't mean that you're right. So the notion of identification is constantly being challenged, is constantly being revamped. So for instance, I'm not anything like I was when I was younger, or when I was a young man. I don't have the same, like views. My worldview has changed based upon living. Of all the experiences that you've had, you take in, and you're constantly revamping your sense of self. However, those who are fixated on believing and thinking in certain ways, let's hope that they have at least thought about why they're believing this way. Especially when there's certain elements of rigidity that people get their back up real quick. This is classic Freud, the defensiveness. People get defensive when you ask them questions about things, ask them to justify why they believe this, and as if they feel that there's an entitlement they have to think and feel whatever they want without having to justify it. Well, why? Because often this is how they were raised. It's not always simple or easy to question the premises of our values without feeling some sense of either defensiveness or vulnerability or exposure. But that's part of growing.